afternoon, and welcome to this invitation-only webcast covering TBR's Network Infrastructure Services Research Highlights. My name is Allison Crawford, and I'm your host for today's session. TBR's focus is to provide business research to accelerate our customers' success, and the issue we'll be covering today comes directly from our 2011 Network Infrastructure Services, or NIS, benchmark. The detailed report includes information on key market trends, as well as major suppliers' performance and strategies. Information our networking and mobility team delivers will be valuable to any firm with plans to expand their footprint or compete effectively in the global NIS market. We're going to present some of our findings to you and get your feedback on this information. To hand this over to Scott, there are a few action items I'd like to cover with you. We will be recording today's session and posting it to the TBR YouTube channel. We invite you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the others we've posted. We'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts on the materials we present today. Please send any questions or comments to the Q&A function or the chat function. Scott will address them at the end of the presentation. Third, send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. Now, let me introduce Scott Dennehy, Senior Analyst on the Networking and Mobility team, TBR. Scott is working in the network infrastructure services space for the past 15 years and is leading our research coverage in NIS. Since TBR in 2010, Scott's insight has helped our clients improve their strategic go-to-market plans and market position. Now, let me hand this over to Scott.
Thanks, Adam. Hello, everyone. $50 has been growing. That's the opportunity that we see within the network infrastructure services, or NIS, market. Successful suppliers that will have a good understanding of key market drivers and strategies of their major competitors. As mentioned, I'm Scott Dennehy. I'm a senior analyst within TBR's networking mobility practice. I've been involved in the network infrastructure market for more years than I care to admit. I have discussed three main topics related to NIS. First, we'll define what exactly we mean by NIS and what is included in TBR's NIS benchmark. We'll look at key trends that are driving enterprise investment in NIS. And we will discuss the performance and key strategies of leading suppliers in major NIS major segments and geographies. Let's get So this snapshot view of essentially our NIS program in terms of the different coverage areas. So first I'd like to talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about network infrastructure. So in our definition of network infrastructure, that includes any of the hardware and software that is powering the network. So you see some of the technologies listed there, things like routers and switches, unified communications, WAN, wireless LAN, those kinds of things. Don't include any endpoint devices, laptops, PCs, tablets, those kinds of things, nor do we include any enterprise applications like ERP, CRM, really trying to focus on that network layer. Obviously, a lot of gray area here, particularly when you're talking about things like convert data infrastructure, because you do not consider the servers and the storage part of the network infrastructure. There is some gray area there, but I feel like we've done a good job as far as isolating that network component. We focus on suppliers. You see the logos there, a lot of network equipment providers as well as IT services firms. Service segments, there are three main ones: maintenance, managed service, professional services, and geographic segments: North America, Central Latin America, EMEA, and APAC. A couple of things to keep in mind as we go through this. First and foremost, again, the financial information that we're providing here in terms of the revenue and the margin is based on 2011. For some of the comments around supply strategy are a little bit more current than that, and take into account some of the activity that these suppliers have been doing with 2012. And so now I have a good understanding, a good foundation of NIS. Let's talk a little bit about some of the key market trends and drivers. So obviously a lot of trends driving enterprise IT purchasing today. We're going to focus really on three main ones. One is customer focused, the other two are more supplier focused. From the end, it's really all about cost reduction, particularly in markets where customers are being asked to continue to do more with less. What that's doing is creating opportunities for suppliers to provide services as well as products that can help drive down those capital and operational expenditures. So things like hosting and cloud, outsourcing and managed services, those are some key growth areas. And from the product side, those are things like unified communications and collaboration. So again, really the cost reduction and how can network infrastructure services help lower costs for enterprise customers. So from a perspective, first and foremost, channels is really a key area that a lot of these suppliers are focusing on. They've recognized by looking at Cisco and their model how useful a strong channel partner program is in driving that revenue growth and profitability. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of suppliers invest very heavily in their channel programs. Good examples of that are of Siemens and Huawei. And quickly, I mentioned earlier about some of the economic challenges that are happening in developed markets. So suppliers, it's really about focusing on those emerging markets. So places like Brazil, Russia, India, and China. That's where they're seeing the growth that's going to have to come from. And some of these more developed markets start to recover a little bit. An example of supplier that's investing very heavily in these emerging countries is IBM. In 2011, they opened 92 branch offices in these countries and added about 1,500 sales reps. So a lot of investment from IBM in terms of emerging markets. In terms of an overall view of supply strategy, and still what I would call largely product-driven, and what I mean by that is products are still very heavily involved in most of the NIS deals. What we're seeing, if you look at the 11 suppliers that we cover in this benchmark, they're split down along two lines, and each one has kind of a different strategy that they're using within this market. On the one, you've got the equipment suppliers, so that's obviously Cisco and Juniper and Huawei, those companies. On the other end, you've got the IT services firms like Accenture and IBM and Fujitsu. HP kind of placed there in the middle. They're a company in the sense that they really utilize strategies of both an equipment supplier and an IT service firm. They've got their own networking gear that they're bringing to market, but they've also got a very strong services component that they can come and do services around other vendors' equipment as well. So they're doing a job as far as leveraging both models. So equipment supplier perspective, it's really about leading with their product and then attaching the services onto those product sales, things like maintenance and higher-end professional services. So as a result, their revenue mix tends to weigh much more heavily on the maintenance side. In fact, the suppliers you see listed there have at least 50 or 60% of their total NIS revenue coming maintenance. On the other end, the IT services firms are really coming at it from a completely different angle. They're leading with their services capabilities and then bringing those products along as needed. As you might, their revenue mix is much more heavily weighted on the professional managed services side. Just to kind of give you an example, taking something like a private cloud deployment, like an Accenture will go in and consult with a client around private cloud and then develop a services solution that includes equipment to enable that private cloud. And then they'll go off and determine which of the best-of-breed partners or which partner makes the most sense as far as the equipment. So it's leading with the services and then bringing that product through. From practices perspective, and we'll get into a little bit of detail as we talk about some of the individual service areas, but from a supplier perspective, what we're seeing some of the best practices are from companies like Cisco and Juniper, and on the IT services side, companies like Accenture and IBM. So now we're the high level market trends and supplier strategy. Let's take a look at the supplier performance and strategy within the individual segments and geographies that we cover within NIS. First, we'll take a look at the total NIS revenue. And what you see here is what we call a bubble chart, and there'll be a few more of these as we go, so I just wanted to give you an idea of how to read these. So horizontal axis there, you've got the total revenue being generated. In this case, it's just total NIS revenue. In vertical axis, you have the year-to-year revenue growth. Now, this is the bubble there determines amount of revenue. So as an example, Cisco has the most revenue here in this case, so they've got the largest bubble. And then you see Accenture and IBM have some of the next biggest bubbles. And then moving backward from there, companies like Infosys and Dell and Huawei have much smaller bubbles because they've got a lower revenue volume. So this just is a better way to visually see how vendors compare to one another in terms of revenue. But thinking about the total NIS revenue here, it's probably no surprise that Cisco is the overwhelming lead here as they leverage that dominant position they have in enterprise networking, again, pulling through those sort of maintenance and professional services. In fact, Cisco gets about 80% of their NIS revenue from maintenance. So again, it's selling that product and those services through that strong channel partner base that they have. IBM, those are the next two leaders. Very similar in the sense that that ability to provide those end-to-end solutions, having that broad ecosystem of best-of-breed partners that they can bring in as needed. Really what enables them to do is present themselves to their clients as very services-focused, and more importantly, vendor agnostic. So it's not about the products and the vendors that are required. It's really about the services that are required and then determining which products and which vendors are needed. A couple of these that I'd like to highlight here as far as ones to watch. Huawei is one of them. You see they've got some pretty high revenue growth there, although that comes from a very small revenue base. We expect that to change over the next year or two as Huawei focuses much more aggressively on that enterprise market. Their goal for enterprise revenue is $15 billion by 2015, and that's actually more than double the goal that they've set for themselves for 2012, which is about $7 billion. Now, that's total enterprise revenue, which obviously includes product, but we expect that there's going to be a significant amount of service revenue within that total number as well. Another company to watch is Dell. Dell's made a much more aggressive play within the network infrastructure market. Acquired Sept last year and followed that up with security appliance Sonic Wall earlier this year, rounding out that networking portfolio and enable them to provide much more complete end-to-end solution, drive some more service revenue as they attach some services to those new products that they have to sell and rely a little bit less on their vendor partners. On total operating margin, you think intuitively that the companies that get the most of their revenue from maintenance have the highest margins, and that's not necessarily the case. There are certainly a lot of other factors involved in terms of their market strategy and their resource management strategy that are driving that revenue performance. So see on the chart here is the blue line, which goes from left to right. That's the operating margin for the 11 companies that we cover, starting left-hand side with Cisco getting the highest operating margin, right down through to Fujitsu in the lowest. The green there tracks the percentage of total NIS revenue that comes from maintenance for each of these vendors, and you see a bit of variance there. Again, it's not necessarily just the equipment providers that are getting high margins to maintenance revenue. So a couple of examples are Infosys and IBM on that higher end, a very low percentage of revenue coming from maintenance, but good margins. And then you've got Avaya and Huawei that get a good chunk of their maintenance revenue from a good chunk of their total revenue, I should say, from maintenance, but are getting good margin performance. And again, it comes down to what their individual strategies are. Like an Infosys, who really doesn't generate a lot of revenue from, and in fact, they're number 11 of the 11 suppliers that we cover. And the reason they're able to get the margins and the reason they have that low revenue number is because they're really focused on a select number of high-end opportunities that they can really differentiate themselves within. So they're not going after a lot of the same opportunities that some of their competitors might, to sacrifice that revenue to keep those margins high. Revenue on the other end, somebody like Huawei, surprised that they're really using that low-cost model to gain in some of their key markets, so they're more than willing to sacrifice the margin to revenue. So, for perspective, even though they're getting about 60% of their total revenue from maintenance, the margins are still pretty low for Huawei. I would say that the strategy that a lot of these vendors are using in terms of driving their margin improvement would be service automation. So in other words, trying to take the human resource element out of the service delivery as much as possible and using more offshore or low-cost labor for a lot of the service delivery. A little bit deeper into the individual segments that we look at. I mentioned we've got 3 here: maintenance, professional services, and managed. Obviously, a lot of the trends that I covered earlier apply to each of these segments, but I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more specifically about some of the trends that are driving each one individually. As I said before, in terms of maintenance, it's really about the equipment providers that are attaching maintenance services to their product sales and give them a nice, steady, and dependable revenue stream. Problem there is there's not a lot of growth opportunities, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Professional services, it's really about network complexity. So with all these new technologies that are being deployed within the network, whether it's virtualization, cloud, big bring your own device, what have you, that's created a lot of challenges for the enterprise IT folks as far as how do they architect their networks to deal with all this. So they're really looking to their suppliers to help guide them and kind of them through these transitions. For services, complexity certainly plays a part in it, particularly as with these new technologies brings a whole new set of vendors and to breed vendors as well, whether you're talking about, say, like a Palo Alto on the security side, or you're talking about an F5 within WAN optimization. So these enterprise networks are getting more complex in terms of the number of vendors that are in there. So being able to come in and provide services around multiple vendors is really a key differentiator for a lot of the suppliers. But in addition to the complexity aspect of it, it's also about cost reduction. As we're finding that it's much cheaper from an FX standpoint to kind of turn the keys over to a vendor that can kind of manage everything. So that's really why they're looking at managed services and outsourcing as a way to help drive those costs down. Get some of the supplier performance and strategy within these segments. So starting with maintenance. Again, probably no surprise that Cisco here is the overwhelming leader. Again, I mentioned 80% of their total revenue comes from maintenance due to those nice high attach rates they get to their product sales. It's kind of clustered in the low end of that scale, particularly key services firms. That's certainly a part of the portfolio in terms of maintenance, but it's obviously not a strategic growth area for them. And it's a real part of the portfolio so that they can provide that end-to-end solution. And in most cases, it's when it comes to discounting, it's the maintenance services that are getting discounted versus the higher-end consulting and professional services. Back to the equipment providers for a second. Before that, this isn't really a strong growth area. There are some opportunities to gain some incremental revenue in maintenance of the equipment providers, but it's really about multi-vendor maintenance. So somebody like a Cisco or a Juniper being able to invest in their capabilities to provide maintenance for their own equipment, but for the vendors' equipment as well. So some opportunities there for incremental revenue, but not significant, certainly not as compared to professional and managed services. Speaking of professional services, you start to see some of the IT services firms establish themselves a little bit more in terms of revenue leadership. Again, that leveraging that model of providing those end-to-end solutions and leading with more of a consultative approach and then bringing through the other services as necessary. Accenture is definitely the best practice leader here in terms of using that consulting-first model and being able to create value, business value, through kinds of services and really look to Accenture in terms of being able to design a project that takes them through the consulting phase, right in through the implementation, integration, and then even the managed services aspect of it. So again, Accenture really the leader here in terms of their approach and strategy. Notice that Cisco is no longer the leader, but they're still generating a lot of revenue in professional services, again, mostly based on the volume in attaching those services to their product sales. And so, like a lot of the other equipers, their strategy is really about providing the high-end professional services that really leverage their expertise. So staying away from the lower-end installation and deployment type services and letting their partners handle a lot of that stuff, avoiding that channel conflict, so enables them to keep their margins high. When Cisco is in talking to a customer about a deployment for the unified computing system, they have some higher-end consulting services they can sell, and then if needed, they don't have the partner expert that can go in and provide the deployment. They may do that, but by and large, it's about letting their partner make money through the value-added services around their equipment and sticking to the more high-end consulting on professional services type engagements. There's some exceptions to that. From an equipment provider perspective, Avaya is one. You see they're fairly up on the total revenue scale there. They, unlike the other equipment providers, they view their services organization as a differentiator for them, and do provide more multi-vendor services in consulting kinds of things to drive more of their revenue in professional services rather than sticking to mostly maintenance. Always another one that we see getting more into the professional services realm, particularly when you're talking about multi-vendor. They're really just getting going in the enterprise space, so they're kind of building their high-end consulting capabilities. So for now, it's more about the low-end implementation deployment type services. Let's move on to managed services. So the leader here, and again, it's really about their scale and that ability to provide managed services really across any technology and across any vendor, and leveraging those best-of-breed partners that they have and being able to come in and allow an enterprise to turn the key over to them and manage their entire network regardless of the network technologies or vendors that they might have in it. From an equipment provider perspective, you'll see that services is really not a big driver for them into NIS revenue. I see Cisco's now really way on the bottom of that scale. And the big reason for that is the investment that's really required to provide managed services in a kind of meaningful way. So it's investing in infrastructure and people, being able to provide those multi-vendor capabilities. There's a good and significant investment there. And particularly when you're talking about companies like Cisco and Juniper that really like to maintain those high margins, that's a difficult decision for them to make as far as whether or not that's a market that they want to get into. So for now, they're staying out of it for the most part, limiting their services involvement to maintenance and professional services. So what do actually, to kind of illustrate for you visually how the difference in strategies between these two vendor types really manifests itself in terms of their performance. So if we could back to slide 9, the maintenance view again. Again, you just go way out in front there, and a lot of the other firms, including the IT services company, really on the lower end in terms of their total revenue. But as you get to slide 10, which is professional services, you start to things kind of break up a little bit more. Key services firms establishing themselves. You still got a couple of equipment vendors there in Cisco and Avaya as they're generate a good amount of revenue from professional services. But by the time you get to managed services at 11, it's really about those IT services firms that have established themselves in that market. And you've got equipment providers really on the lower end of that scale in terms of managed services revenue. So just a visual representation of how those different strategies show up in terms of financial performance. So what there was just highlight some of the that we're doing within the NA market. This month we'll be publishing our second quarter 2012 this benchmark. Similar to what you see here, or what I presented to you here today. A couple of differences. Primarily, we're looking at 4 services within the dated benchmark. We're taking deployment services out of professional services and making it its own category. Another difference is the level of of insight and analysis that will provide. I've just given you a couple of highlights here for 2011, but the 2012 or 2012 benchmark will have more analysis in terms of the leaders within each of the categories in the strategies and market trends. So now we've foundation of what exactly TBO defines NIS or as and what's covered in our benchmark. We've looked at some of the key market trends and as well as the suppliers that as well as the performance strategies of the major suppliers. I will now take some questions.
Great, thanks, Scott. One of the questions that came in, it was actually a clarification. What does Scott mean, so slide 10, Scott?
Sure.
What does Scott mean by 80% of revenue from maintenance? Does he mean 80% AR or out of the 100, 80 is maintenance services?
That's correct, yeah. So 100% of their total NI, or I should say 80% of their total NIS revenue come from maintenance. Yeah, I think I misstepped a couple of times there in terms of getting the two confused, but most percentages that I quoted are the percent of that particular service category versus the total amount.
The next question came in as, what are some other major suppliers that are playing in this space?
It's a market in terms of that it's very fragmented. Right? The supply that we cover here have we think are the bigger ones in the market, but when we talk about some of the integrators that might be playing in particular segments, whether that's the public sector or you've got the thousands of resellers and Cisco VARs that are doing installation and deployment services around Cisco products, you've got a pretty good size market in terms of the number of vendors. I would say the one group of companies that's not here, and I would expect that they'll start to be more included in the coverage, the actual telcos. So companies like AT&T and Verizon, BT, Orange Business, companies have pretty sizable enterprise services divisions, being them much more active in this market, particularly the resale channel for a lot of the equipment providers and providing a lot of the maintenance professional and particularly managed services around that equipment. These companies have a long heritage and a lot of experience in the hosting business, and they're using that to their advantage to provide hosting, cloud, and managed services around a network equipment.
Great. This one came in is, how do you characterize deployment services and how do they differ from professional services?
Deployment services would essentially focus on another way to maybe put that would be something like engineering, furnishing, and installation. So more installation, implementation, turn-up type services, as opposed to something like system integration where you're bringing multiple technologies together, and certainly a little bit different than planning and design where you're kind of talking to a customer about the deployment to actually going and doing the work. So it's more of engineering, installation, and implementation piece, getting that network to the point where it's ready to go live.
Great. The next question we have to come in, can Scott discuss cloud infrastructure providers making inroads?
Some there, I guess, is maybe you're talking about somebody like Rackspace, or we might even group the telcos in that category, which I touched on already.
Yes.
I think it's interesting when you talk about cloud because there's a lot of things happening there. I think by and large, from a cloud perspective, it's more about the data center infrastructure. When you talk about somebody like an Oracle that's bringing more of their appliances to the table, in the case of an HP and IBM, they've got that heritage within servers and storage. So I think I don't necessarily see any of the pure play providers, whether you're talking about an Amazon or a Google, getting involved in this market. After that, it certainly does get a little bit fuzzy. Really, what you're going to see from a competitive perspective in cloud, if anything, is really going to be from the network operators, the telcos. Those services firms have a strong cloud portfolio, whether that's HP, IBM, and some of those others.
Great. One more question. The question that came in is, can you provide some more insight into Huawei and its strategy, particularly in North America?
Sure. So everybody's interested in Huawei these days. So as I mentioned before, they've got very aggressive goals for their enterprise business. And North America is one of those, one of the regions that they really just have almost zero customer base in at this point. It's really the biggest area, the biggest region that they haven't tackled yet. They're going to do that through the channel. Their goal really is to have 100% of their revenue, enterprise revenue, all geographies, but North America in particular, to come through the channel. So everybody knows the issues that Huawei has had in terms of the government scrutiny and those kinds of things. But at this point, they have been undeterred, and we don't expect them to stop trying. And they're really going to leverage the experience that they have on the telco side, which is really about 80% of their business, and using those services that they have almost as a bargaining chip. So they're investing in their services capabilities. At the end of the day, it's really about selling that product. So they'll use the services as a bargaining chip to come in and either heavily discount those or offer them as part of an overall product sale to get that product installed. Because particularly in North America, the more customer studies that they can provide, the more installations that they can do, the more product they have in the market, the easier it's going to get for them to grow within North America. It's really about getting those first couple of customers. But for them, I think it's going to be about leading with those services and using those as a bargaining chip to pull those products through.
Thank you, Scott, and I want to thank everybody on the call for joining us today. We've enjoyed this interaction and really enjoyed your questions. What we're going to do is leave the chat function open for another few minutes in case anyone has any last-minute questions or would like to set up additional conversations with Scott around this report. If you'd like to get information about the report, you can either reach out to Scott or your sales rep. And we want to give you an update on, we have a couple more webinars that you may be of interest to attend. We'll be doing telecom infrastructure services on October 9th, networking and mobility vendor benchmark webinar on October 11th, and the Youth and Canadian Mobile Operators Review on October 16th. So look for the invitations in your mailbox, or you can go to the link where you register for this webinar and be able to add those webinars to your calendar. And we'll be doing, as Scott mentioned, the update next quarter, so please look at that as well. And we look forward to talking to you guys over the next couple of months. Great day, everyone.